Hello, people. I finished the book Montcalm and Wolfe, The French and Indian War. This is written by Francis Parkman, and Francis Parkman has wrote, I believe it's a 6-volume history of just the machinations of the French and English in North America. And I would love to get the whole set. I mean, there's people that compare this to Gibbon's Rome. This was really good. I don't know if it was Gibbon good, but it was pretty good. Actually, I really love this book. This is one of those rare books that, as you get towards the end of it, you're like, "Fuck, I'm almost done." Now I gotta gamble on some other book and see how it is. So let's get into the notes here, because this is probably going to be a long video. Originally, this was published in 1884. So, just after the Revolutionary War, Parkman sat down and wrote these volumes. This is supposed to be the best one out of the bunch, and I have to say it again. I really enjoyed it. Of course, everybody realizes that the French and Indian War, in the United States, we're the only ones that call it the French and Indian War. This is the 7 Years' War. And a lot of historians would love to be able to refer to this as the First World War, because there was so many different countries involved. And there was fighting in India, there was fighting in the Spice Islands, there was fighting in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, Canada, the continental United States. Everywhere there was fighting, and just about everybody was involved. In fact, Frederick the Great, one of his more humorous quotes is Sweden? We were fighting Sweden too? Because the Swedes just didn't do very much. Of course, he knew they were fighting the Swedes, but that was his way of making a dig at them. Frederick the Great was fun. All right, 547 pages. Near the bottom on page 44, so right away I'm finding things that are of note. Yeah, this is about Detroit, my hometown. Near the bottom, the situation, and this guy's name is Father Bonnekamp. This Parkman guy, he really researched this. He found people's letters, he found, official communiques, and he used all of that to write this book. The situation, he says, is charming. A fine river flows at the foot of the fortifications. Vast meadows, asking only to be tilled, extend beyond sight. Nothing can be more agreeable than the climate. Winter hardly lasts 2 months. European grains and fruits grow here far better than in many parts of France. It is the Touraine and the Bayous of Canada. Whatever the fuck that is. Also, the next paragraph. Great efforts were made at the same time to build up Detroit as a center of French power in the West. The methods employed were of the debilitating paternal character long familiar to Canada. All immigrants from families were to be carried thither at the king's expense, and every settler was to receive in free gift a gun, a hoe, an axe, a plowshare, a scythe, a sickle, 2 augers, large and small, a sow, 6 hens, a cock, 6 pounds of powder, and 12 pounds of lead. While to these favors were added many more. So, you know what? I could have a pretty good time with all of that stuff. I wish somebody would give me all that stuff. This author maintains that George Washington begins the 7-Year War. And it's kind of interesting to read quotes from George Washington and accounts of his escapades when he is in service of the English crown. He You know, he's the thought of an independent colony at that time. Nobody had that thought. In fact, later on in the book, Franklin is saying that Ben Franklin is saying that there's no way England ever has to worry about that because these 13 colonies can never agree about anything. So, last sentence, top of page 88. What it is the French are menacing the southern colonies. You know, Virginia, that kind of shit. And George Washington goes out there with some colonials and gives battle to these guys that are camped there. They're actually camped there. The French and the Indians are camped there, waiting for word that would give them permission to attack. And George Washington attacks instead. So I don't know whether there was anything afoot in Europe at that time. Maybe this was the first action of the French-Indian War. Judge it as we may, this obscure skirmish began the war that set the world on fire. According to Parkman, Washington's action there was, it started the damn war. 7-year war. Acadia, not Arcadia, Acadia. Acadia is an area that I guess is in Canada. I don't know, the map was not great. But there was fighting there. The French had forts there. The English eventually took these forts. And they literally rounded up these populations of French people who were living like savages, rounded them up and got them the hell out of there. All these like little islands that are around the mouth of the St. Lawrence, that's what I take to be Acadia. And a little bit of the information about where they had put those people is some of them went to Louisiana. So I think that maybe that's, you know, where the Creole population in part may have come from. And I have a note here that says Parkman's description of the wilderness dash Conrad, because his description of the wilderness reminds me of Heart of Darkness, where Joseph Conrad many times talks about the primeval forest that they are moving through. And at this time, this is in like 1752, I think it goes from 1754 to 1761, something like that. The, you know, east of the Mississippi is just a primeval forest. It is an old growth forest. It's a gorgeous thing. It still is in the War of 1812. And, you know, all I can say about that is I was born 200 years too late, because that's, I would just fucking strip off my clothes and run naked through that shit. Bougainville is with Montcalm. Montcalm is the Frenchman. Wolfe is the Englishman. And Bougainville, if you've ever been down south in Florida or anything like that, there is this creeping vine-like plant with some very beautiful flowers on it. Thorny as fuck. And they call it bougainvillea. And Bougainville, all Parkman says about Bougainville is that he, you know, later on he becomes a navigator. But Bougainville, I think, circumnavigates the earth later on. And the thing that's important about his circumnavigation, because, you know, several people have already done it, but Bougainville has on board his ship a woman dressed as a man, and she is the first woman to circumnavigate the globe. And he explores around in Africa, and that's where they find the bougainvillea flower. That's where it comes from. Third paragraph, page 277. 277. I passed it. This is a little bit about the Indians. The Indians were pretty brutal, and the French, for most of this war, had more Indian allies than the British did. They both had Indian allies, and they both had a very difficult time controlling the Indian allies because the Indians wanted to just scalp people, men, women, and children. It didn't make no difference. Um, the English were much more successful in controlling their murderous tendencies. It remained to muster the mission Indians settled in or near the limits of the colony, and it was to this end that Montcalm went to sing the war song with the converts of the two mountains. Regard, Bougainville, young Longueuil, and others were of the party. And when they landed, the Indians came down to the shore, their priests at their head, and greeted the general with a volley of musketry. Then received him after dark in their grand council lodge, where the circle of wild and savage visages, half seen in the dim light of a few candles, suggested to Bougainville a midnight conclave of wizards. He acted vicariously the chief part of the ceremony. I sang the war song in the name of Mr. Montcalm, and was much applauded. It was nothing but these words: "Let us trample the English under our feet," chanted over and over again, in cadence with the movements of the savages. Then came the war feast, against which Montcalm had caused 3 oxen to be roasted. On the next day the party went to Caughnawaga, or St. Louis, where the ceremony was repeated, and Bougainville, who sang again the war song in the name of his commander, was required by adoption into the clan of the Turtle. There 3 more oxen were solemnly devoured, and with one voice the warriors took up the hatchet. Actually, I don't know why the hell there was a lot better paragraphs than that about the Indians. Top of 331. There's a change of government in England, where Pitt takes over as the prime minister. And this is Pitt the Younger. I've always been a little bit confused about that, so I had to Google it, and yes, indeed, there was 2 Pitts. And Frederick of Prussia, of course this is Frederick the Great. Maybe in 1884 nobody called him the Great, I don't know. But they never referred to him as that. They just say, "England has long been in labor," said Frederick of Prussia, "and at last she has brought forth a man." And that's what Frederick thinks about Pitt. Regular officers versus colony officers. Last sentence, top is 374. And when I say regular officers, I mean officers from England. Colony officers, have been in the colonies for a while. Possibly were born here. Top of 374. Towards the provincials, their attitude was one of tranquil superiority, though its tranquility was occasionally disturbed by what they regarded as absurd pretensions on the part of the colony officers. One of them gave vent to his feelings in an article in the London Chronicle, in which he advanced the very reasonable proposition that a farmer is not to be taken from the plow and made an officer in a day. What it is when they were making plans for advances and campaigns, the royal officers, I'm going to say that, didn't even include the colonial officers. So the colonial officers got a little bit pissed off about this, George Washington included, and part of that led to the feelings of, hey, let's ditch England and become our own country. They were pissed off about that. The French had forts all over the place. What it is the French claimed the entire North America, Canada and the United States. And they didn't want the English to advance out of their original colonies. So they had forts all along the St. Lawrence Seaway, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie. They didn't want the English to get any further than the mountain range there. The Smokies is part of it. But it all kind of, the French and the Indians, they tried to defend these forts. The English took them. little by little, they took them all. Towards the end, it all devolves upon Montreal and Quebec. And the big fight is at Quebec. And actually, both of them die there. Montcalm dies there. Wolfe dies there. Poor Montcalm. He just wanted to get back to France. He had a wife and kids there. He had just built a mill to grind grain. He had olive trees there, and the mill, I think, was grinding his olives and making oil out of it. He writes, there's a lot of stuff in here about the letters that he writes back to France. He just wants to get home. Wolfe, I don't think, is married, and Wolfe writes letters to his mother, and they're both fairly young. I think Montcalm is older, like 40s and 30s. They're not old guys. Bottom of 433 to the top of 434, and this is Quebec. There was a lot of fighting there. The English finally figured out a place to land where they're kind of unopposed. I mean, there's a little bit, they have to do a little bit of fighting, but they land their men, march them up this hill. They get on what they call the Plains of Abraham, and they just array them out in battle form, and they dare the French to come out and attack them. The French do, and the English are better. They're more solid. They just advance. They don't care whether they're getting shot down or not, and the French end up running. So Quebec changes hand. Day after day went by, and the invaders made no progress. Flags of truce often passed between the hostile camps. "You will demolish the town, no doubt," said the bearer of one of them, "but you shall never get inside it." To which Wolfe replied, "I will have Quebec if I stay here till the end of November." Sometimes the heat was intense, and sometimes there were floods of summer rain that inundated the tents. Along the river from the Montmorency to Point Levy, there were ceaseless artillery fights between gunboats, frigates, and batteries on the shore. Bands of Indians infested the outskirts of the camp, killing sentries and patrols. The Rangers chased them through the woods where there were brisk skirmishes and scalps lost and won. Sometimes the regulars took part in these forest battles, and once it was announced in orders of the day that the general has ordered 2 sheep and some rum to Captain Costnan's company of grenadiers for the spirit they showed this morning in pushing those scoundrels of Indians. The Indians complained that the British soldiers were learning how to fight, and no longer stood still in a mass to be shot at, as in Braddock's time. The Canadians mixed with their red allies and wore their livery. One of them was caught on the 18th. He was naked, daubed red and blue, and adorned with a bunch of painted feathers dangling from the top of his head. He and his companions used the scalping knife as freely as the Indians themselves, nor were the New England Rangers much behind them in this respect, till an order came from Wolfe forbidding the inhuman practice of scalping, except when the enemy are Indians, or Canadians dressed like Indians. 433, middle of the second paragraph. 443. Frequent employment. Let's see if I can find this. A frequent employment was the cutting of spruce tops to make spruce beer. This innocent beverage was reputed sovereign against scurvy, and such was the fame of its virtues that a copious supply of the West Indian molasses used in concocting it was thought indispensable to every army or garrison in the wilderness. Throughout this campaign it is repeatedly mentioned in general orders, and the soldiers are promised that they shall have as much of it as they want at a halfpenny a quart. And I looked up spruce beer. It's non-alcoholic, so I'm not going to bother making any spruce beer. My last note here is when they finally have the peace negotiations for the 7 Years' War. All the countries are represented, but nobody bothers to make any kind of representation for the Indians. And I don't know about the Revolutionary War, but in the War of 1812, the Indians kind of hang out with the English. The English do the wampum thing with them. And I guess that's it.